The entire contents of this podcast and website are based upon the opinions of Tammy Garcia and her guests, unless otherwise noted. The information on this podcast is not intended to replace a one-on-one relationship with a qualified healthcare professional and is not intended as medical advice. It is intended as a sharing of knowledge and information from the research and experience of Tammy Garcia and her guests. This is the Naturally Inspired Podcast, coming to you from our 1890 homestead in Johnstown, Colorado. I'm Tammy, and I want to thank you for joining us. Let's get started and help people feel good so they can do what they love for longer. Today on the Naturally Inspired Podcast, Gerald Posner is joining us. Gerald is the author of 13 books. His latest book is called Pharma, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. Gerald is a former lawyer. It is through being a lawyer that he discovered his passion for research. And so he stopped being a lawyer and became an author. The stories he brings to light are crucial to understanding our history, and his latest book, Pharma, could not be more relevant for today. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Naturally Inspired Podcast with Gerald Posner. Thank you so much for being here today on the Naturally Inspired Podcast. It's an honor that you'll spend some time with me. It is, a pressing time right now. So much going on, right? Lots of chaos. And you've got this great new book that came out in March. It's called Pharma. What was that planned? Or tell me the story about that first off.
Yeah, no, it wasn't planned in the sense that publishing is an unusual business in the sense that you finish your manuscript with a traditional publisher, Simon & Schuster, or whether it's Random House or whoever. You finish the manuscript and it goes off to the printer. It's checked by all the fact checkers and the lawyers and everything else about 2.5 months before it hits the bookstores. So this book was sent off in late January. It was set for March 10th publication. That's its rollout. I had a 12-city book tour plan that would take me around the country. Right. And we published on March 10th. And on March 11th, the next day, the World Health Organization declared COVID a pandemic. So timing was good in the sense that the next to last chapter, as you know, is called The Coming Pandemic and ends with a quote from an infectious disease doctor back in 2016 saying, by the way, when it comes to the next pandemic, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So it seems as though it's predicting it, but it's really not. What it is talking about this sort of complicated, wonderful, fascinating, at times infuriating history of the American drug industry that just happens to land in a historic pandemic.
Right. I mean, I figured as much because obviously the process of writing a book is a long process, but it's just actually pretty remarkable how it panned out there.
Yeah, and I will say that publishing, by the way, as a sidelight, is riddled with stories, good and bad, about timing. So I have an acquaintance that I know who did a book on the Supreme Court that was published seriously on September 10th. 2001, the day before 9/11. No one knows that book was ever out because the next day we focused on something else. But there was also a historian who did a book years ago in the 90s called The Prize about the history of oil. He was late on getting that book to his publisher by a couple of years. When it came out, it was just after the first Gulf War, and suddenly everybody in the country was interested in oil. Right. And so that book did very, very well. So you never know with timing. Sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you don't.
Right. So you just keep writing.
That's it. That's exactly right. And you publish when you're ready, and you hope that there isn't some other topic that has taken away everybody's attention.
Right. Perfect. Well, we always start with a little bit of getting to know our guests too. So where are you from, Gerald?
Originally born and raised in San Francisco, in the city, which is unusual. My parents were first generations Americans, both immigrant families, Italian Catholic on one side, and father was Polish and Russian Jewish on the other side. And they were born in San Francisco. I was raised there, went to Catholic schools, Sisters of Charity, and then the Jesuits, and before going on to Berkeley in the early 70s, and then went to law school and moved to New York. And I figured I'd try New York for a couple of years as a lawyer, and then 2 years after being there, the best thing that happened is I won mega lottery, not the real lottery, but the lottery in terms of meeting someone, Trisha, who is my wife for the past 40 years, and
Wow.
we have a great relationship together. We work on all our book projects together, and I actually turned to writing as a lawyer who was doing a pro bono lawsuit. When you give your time, you don't charge for it. I was representing a couple of twins who had been experimented on at the largest Nazi concentration camp by this Nazi doctor who they
Mm-hmm.
thought was still alive, and the angel of death, as they called him, Joseph Mengele.
Mangala.
And that
Yeah.
suit went nowhere, got tossed out of federal court. But I
Hmm.
had gathered tens of thousands of pages of documents about him. And I thought, this could be an interesting biography. And that turned into the first book. And I liked it so much. I came back to Trisha and said, Trisha, I was in Paraguay on these Nazi files, and I met some Corsicans who had actually fled. She had been there and she had to come back to New York. After she went back to New York, I met these Corsicans who had fled Europe because they had been wanted for crimes in heroin dealing. And they told me, this is back in '84, they said, by the way, the heroin trade used to be a wonderful business. It takes a criminal to say that, but it's been taken over by the Chinese. And I said to Trisha, evidently these Corsicans say the heroin trade's been taken over by the Chinese, by triads out of Hong Kong. Do you want to do a book on that? And she said, sure. And I knew I had really found the right partner.
I
So
guess.
that became our second book. And since then, 15 books later, that's what we've been doing. So I'm a non-practicing attorney.
That's amazing. What an amazing bond that you have, not only in life, but through your work as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we always say, and you'll know this, anybody who has a relationship, we not only love each other, but we like each other. There's a
Yeah.
difference. You'll sometimes see couples who are together for a long time; they just don't seem that nice to each other.
Right.
Uh, and so we actually enjoy it. We're each other's best
Yeah.
friends. I know that sounds like a hackneyed expression, but true. We're never bored, and we sort of enjoy ourselves with these projects as well. So
Yeah.
it's good that we share this.
Yeah. I could see how that would work because you're constantly uncovering new information, so there's always new stuff to talk about.
Yeah, that's right. If you're nosy, as we are, you like research, which we do, you like
Right.
uncovering new things, then it allows you to do it.
Yeah. I want to talk about that research piece a little bit because in today's world, as you are well aware, we are getting bombarded with information, and a lot of it's garbage, right? A lot of it's fake news. It's not vetted, but it just gets pumped out at such a rapid level. And us as the regular public, we're starting to question everything, which I think is great. Finally, people are like, "Wow, just because this is in print or on the news doesn't make it so." But how do we go that next step and start to really, vet our journalists? Because I think it's now all about our journalists. It's not about the outlet anymore. It can't be. It
Yeah.
has to be about picking a person and, getting to know, like, and trust them and then following them. So what's
Yeah.
your process?
Yeah, it's very interesting you say that because I do think that, with the flood, the great promise of the internet is easy access to information. The great curse of the internet is easy access to information, a
Right.
lot of which happens to be wrong. And I think that the rush to get things done, and there's no doubt that that's happened. Daily newspapers used to have to run, the next print edition was out the next day.
Right.
Now there's a rush to get that news up right away on Twitter and social media
Mhm.
before it's out in the paper. And I think that has created shortcuts for otherwise at times good journalists and for
Mhm.
newspapers and news organizations as well. So I have a process I go through because I have the luxury of time with a book
Right.
where I get information from something. Let's say I get a file from the government on a freedom of information request where you as an individual request files from a government agency. And in
Mhm.
this case, on Pharma, after a while, the FBI sent me documents regarding individuals that turn out to be very interesting in the history of pharmaceuticals.
Hmm.
Now, I have to find out not that those documents are real, I know they're real, but are there other documents that might contradict what I have? Then I go out and I try to do interviews based upon the information in those documents. I'll find people who are still alive. Now, if I get somebody to talk to me, that's fine if they're on the record. But often, all of us as readers and takers of information today see many sources are anonymous. There's, quote, somebody who's an inside source, a senior administration official, somebody
Yep.
who was involved in the campaign or whatever. I was talking in terms of politics.
Yep.
And you don't know if that person was high ranking. You don't know if the person was low ranking, if they had full access to the information. And most of all, and I always think of this as the reporter, the researcher, the writer doing the book. If
Mhm.
somebody talks to me and gives me explosive information, and I've had it before in books on why America slept about 9/11, I ask myself first, why are they telling me this? Nobody,
What's the motivation?
very few people do it just out of the goodness of their heart. And if they are doing it out of the goodness of their heart because they want the information public, why are you telling me? Why aren't you telling somebody at a more prominent, a newspaper or something to get it out tomorrow, or a network for the news station? Why am I getting it? What's the motivation behind it? Now, that doesn't mean that the information's false, but you have to question it yourself as a reporter to
Right.
find out if you're just doing what I call the legwork for somebody who has an agenda, or whether you're
Mhm.
really reporting the facts as honestly as you can. And I
Right.
think that in the rush we have to get news out, that a lot of journalists don't do that any longer. They aren't making those extra calls. They aren't sort of vetting it, and the organizations aren't. And they feel free, Tammy, to correct it the following day, to say, oh, we got it wrong. And the correction, of course, gets very little press, because what gets the
Right.
press is the headline. And
Right.
what can we do as consumers of information? Only be skeptical. You're right. You can latch on to a reporter that you happen to trust, who you think he or she has really been good on doing their reporting over time, and follow them no matter where they are. But I
Mhm.
think that you just have to have a degree of skepticism up, and know that we're consuming information. And that's why I have 250, almost 300 pages, as you know, of source notes in my book,
Yeah.
because I want people to be able to say, hey, that conclusion about that to do with a vaccine, how do I know that that's really right? And the reason I say it's right, then look at what I base that on. Now, you could look up
Right.
the underlying information and disagree with me, and maybe we can debate that all day long. But I think it's important to know how reporters reach their conclusions. And we don't always have it that transparent any longer.
Right. I like that statement that you made. What am I basing this on? You
Yeah, I
know?
mean, what am I basing it on? And also, it's very interesting. I think that you'll find this, and it comes into health, it comes into natural cures, it comes into pharmaceutical business and health as well. But the people, we're in such divergent camps today. That we're so much sort of polarized camps, that people immediately try to put things into a political perspective. So I'm often asked,
Yes.
"Oh, by the way, so is your book kinder to Democrats or kinder to Republicans? Is it a pro-Republican book or a pro-Democratic book?" And I say, boy, it's neither. There are times, you pick a decade. Depending on the decade, I'm going to say
Mhm.
that the blame was on the Democrats for not having done more on regulating pharma. And give me another decade, I'll say it was the Republicans. I'm sort of a pox on both your houses. Uh, Pharma's been very successful at lobbying both of them over time and
Yeah.
getting their way. So I don't see things always through the prism of having to put a flag onto a product of journalism and say it's from one camp or another. That's the problem. We can't
Yeah.
look at things often just in a general sense.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think that's a huge part of the problem today with news is that it is marketed to a political side specifically, and then we miss the truth.
Yeah. No, 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 no. That's absolutely true. And it's so interesting. I mean, one of the things that I've always liked, and I guess that I'm a dinosaur in the book business, is, and this happened in 2017. They released the federal government did sort of the last batch of Kennedy assassination files.
Yeah,
I did a book a long time ago.
yeah.
I went on that book, and I was on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. Three
Mhm.
networks you wouldn't think necessarily. You normally see a person just on one or the other. I
Right.
liked the fact that I could go on them, and I wasn't talking about politics. I was talking, in fact, about something factually that took place, and that's the same with this book. I feel as though you can discuss the pharmaceutical industry, the problems that we have with big pharma, the problems with drugs and health, and all the wellness issues, without necessarily having to take a stance into one camp or another. And that's unfortunate, because
Yeah.
I think that, from my perspective, that's the real role of a journalist, is to
Mhm.
lay out the story. There used to be a show when I grew up called Dragnet, and Joe
Mhm.
Friday said, "Just the facts, ma'am." And that's
Yep.
sort of just the fact. Let the reader draw the conclusion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I like that about your book because, the title, it would imply that maybe, it's all going to be, lies and deceit behind pharma, which there's a fair amount of that for sure. But when you actually read the book, you give credit where credit is due.
I'm glad you said that. Thanks. I forgot to say that. No, but what I mean by that is the subtitle. I love my publisher is fantastic, and I'm very lucky to have a publisher that allows me to select a subject without knowing what I'm going to conclude because I haven't done the research yet, and then go out for a few
Right.
years and find it. So that's fortunate.
Right.
But they sort of that was their subtitle: "Greed Lies in the Poisoning of America." I wanted something much more mundane, like a history of the American pharmaceutical industry or American drug industry, and they thought that was a little boring, I think.
Yeah.
Uh,
I get
but
it.
the I do think that there are plenty of stories of greed and people going over the line here, but there are also some great stories about people inside the lab looking for real cures,
Right.
of the industry finding things that have changed our lives, from penicillin and others, and making them
Right.
available. And there's some physicians who were running drug companies, who provided drugs that they discovered free to developing countries, and those stories are great.
Yeah.
I think that as people, we often tend to focus on, the old line is, what's the story? Dog bites man, or man bites dog. It's the man bites dog is the unusual story. So we tend to look at the greed and corruption stories, and they get the focus. But I
Right.
do try to balance it out.
I think you did a remarkable job of that, and that should be something I think as consumers of information too. That should strike us as something that's truthful when we see, one side being represented, but also the other side being represented, and so you can have a valid argument in your head because that was what critical thinking is.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and it's very interesting that because I guess in part I I was on the debate team in high school and then in college, and so you learn to argue both
Right.
sides of the issue. In your
Hmm.
heart, you really happen to like one side. I
Right.
understand that. That's
Yep.
the one you really believe in, but you have to be just as effective if you're going to be a winning debater in arguing the side that you really don't believe in, but you're able to make the case for it. You
Yeah.
understand how that works. And I
Yeah.
think that in terms of reporting, and especially if you're doing an industry like the pharmaceutical industry, it's too easy. It's almost like cheating in a sense to go ahead and just do a story that says they always wear a black hat, they're always terrible,
Right.
they always do the wrong thing because that's their reputation.
Right.
Instead, the more complicated story, Tammy, is what we have in every industry. I don't care if you're talking about law or doctors or architects or government workers. There's going to be good and bad. There are
That's right.
some that are really diligent and do the best they can and turn out some great work. And there are going to be some people who are gaming the system who should end up behind prison bars. And that's the same in the drug business. It's no different.
Absolutely. And when you're looking at a story like that too, it's so good to make sure that you bring both sides to the table because if you're not doing that, the thing that you talked about, you have a way that you want it to go in your heart and you want to believe that way. Well, if you're too far on one side, you're actually hurting your cause.
There, no question. I mean, I will sometimes read whether it's a magazine article, a newspaper piece, or sometimes even a book, in which essentially instead of presenting what I call the facts, they're really mixing into their presentation. Pretty much, you can see their opinion very clearly, and they
Right.
keep driving it home time and time again. And to me, the more that happens, the less power and impact that story has,
Yes.
because there's something that we view in terms of law, and it works in every business in terms of journalism as well. It's confirmation bias. So
Hmm.
you go into, if I go to a publisher and I say, by the way, I conclude this is my conclusion for the book. I haven't done my research yet, but I think I can do a book that says X, Y, and Z. Then you go out and you only look for the evidence, quote unquote, or the people to do interviews that fill your view of the world. And you
Right.
can do that. You can fill it in, and that becomes therefore self-fulfilling prophecy. The more exciting part, from my perspective, from what Trisha likes, is going out and not knowing what you're going to find out. And some
Yeah.
things are dead ends, and some things you chase for a month or two, and it turns out not to be productive. And somebody else who think you're is going to be Aaron Brockovich and become a great whistleblower turns out not to be one, or whatever else, or all of
Right.
those.
Right.
And then you end up with a lot of stories you can't include in the book because it's too much. I mean, you
Right.
narrow it down, but that not knowing what the story is in its entirety is the excitement.
Absolutely, and it's interesting because that's a total parallel to science. You come up with a hypothesis, and it's you shouldn't be wanting to prove it right or wrong, and that's kind of a slippery slope that we get into with pharmaceutical companies as well, because a lot of our studies are funded by the product maker.
Yeah, that's right. So it's so interesting to think that we're in a situation in which the manufacturer of the product is actually subsidizing the study, and
Hmm.
so it's not surprising that in those instances in which pharmaceutical companies back the study, they have a much higher percentage, over 75%, of returning a good result, as opposed to when the studies
Right.
are just done from an uninterested source, a university or government financing. Uh, it's even the problem, we see it occasionally, and I report a few of them in the book, in which you'll have instances in which the leading medical journals, like the Journal of the American Medical Association or Lancet, the leading British journal, have
Yep.
had to retract a study because it turns out that the researchers involved had fiddled with the numbers, had
Hmm.
actually had fraud in getting. There's a case in which they aren't necessarily doing it to make money, but they so believe the conclusion, either the worth of a drug or their conclusion about a connection between two illnesses or that they can't actually look at any evidence that contradicts that. And instead, they go out of their way to make their case. It's sort of like when you hear a prosecutor has withheld exculpatory evidence. They only
Right.
want to make sure that they get the
Right.
guilty evidence in. And that's a problem that we face in the medical field in particular, because it affects people's lives and health eventually.
That's right. That's right. I want to back up just a little bit and talk about how you got started with writing pharma. I know that you're obviously a very inquisitive person and kind of have this background of hunting down the truth and getting the facts. But was there something particular that led you to this book, Pharma?
Pharma had been on what I call sort of our wish list to do
Okay.
for a long time, since the 90s. So what happens with books is you end up doing a book on a project that comes along, and it's fine. The publisher's interested and you're interested, but you have sort of what I view as projects down the road you'd like to do. And Pharma had been a book that I thought about doing from really 97, 98, around the time I was doing a book on the Martin Luther King assassination. I was committed to do a book on the business of Motown. So that came first. And then I said to Tricia, so now we can do Pharma as a project. And then 9/11 came along, and ended up doing a book on why America slept in 2003. And that led to a book about the kingdom in Saudi Arabia in 2005. It got us officially banned from the
Mm,
kingdom. So
wow.
and then got segued into a book on the history of Miami Beach, and then a book on a 200-year history of the finances of the Vatican. So those are all
One thing leads to another, eh?
one thing leads to another, and finally, after that, we were able to say to the publisher, Pharma. And what was interesting, and you'll appreciate this, the book that I envisioned in '97 was very, very different than the book I started in
Mm,
2015, and that's because of the opioid crisis, which had
right.
taken place in that period and suddenly was a dominant issue, the most lethal, prescription drug epidemic in American history had
For
happened in a
sure.
25-year period.
I'm not sure. I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone whose life hasn't been affected by the opioid crisis in this country.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I thought initially that I would write a chapter or two about opioids, because there have been some very good reporters and authors who have written detailed books about the opioid crisis.
Mhm.
And I thought there wasn't much to add. And not only was there a lot to add, because I got information about the family that ran Purdue and had this blockbuster OxyContin, about how they were involved in the drug business, the Sacklers, much earlier in the 50s and 60s
Mhm.
as sort of kingpins. But I was motivated personally. Sometimes research sounds as though it's papers, documents, and you do some interviews. And it has a very antiseptic feel to it in that sense, but it also can be very emotional and very moving. And there's no better case than Marianne Skolic Perez, who I wrote a chapter called "You've Messed with the Wrong Mother,"
Mhm.
who is, I've since met a number of parents who have lost a child, a son or a daughter, to opioids, and they've all somehow dealt with their grief. Many of them have dealt with their grief through activism. She was the first one that I came across, and she lit a fire in Tricia and me. Her
Mhm.
story about how she lost her daughter Jill, in 2002, and how she went on to deal with that by sort of battling Purdue as a one-person army.
Oh
How
my
she
gosh.
gets the FDA to be the first one to write a letter to them to say you're marketing this incorrectly for osteoarthritis. How she's working with a prosecutor to bring charges, and then now in 2007, when they plead guilty to these civil felonies and pay a $600 million fine, she's making an impact statement saying to them, in essence, and says the same thing to the Senate a few months later, looking at the executives, I'm going to be, you look over your shoulder when you come out with these drugs, because I'm going to be chasing you all the time until I bring some justice to this. And it's that sort of on fire response from a parent who has lost a child
Yeah.
that then turns us on as researchers to redouble our efforts. So it has a very personal edge. If you read something like her chapter, "You messed with the wrong mother," is what she says to a Purdue executive who tries to sully her daughter's reputation. And it just redoubles what she's doing. And she says, "You've messed with the wrong mother." And she was right.
It's perfect. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think with what's going on right now, we're seeing an uprising in moms who have had it,
Hmm.
with all of the things that are going on, particularly with vaccines as well.
Yeah, no,
Um,
that's right. Look, it was mothers who who made the effort on drunk driving,
mhm.
and bad. It's interesting that mothers who have lost children are often the ones at the front lines on forcing public change. And I think
Mhm.
that is happening here, both on opioids and, you're right, on vaccines and other areas that are relevant to all of our lives.
Absolutely. So let's go back to a little bit of the history, the early days, because I want people to get a feel for this incredible book because they definitely need to get it. Because I think what happens is we look at the baked cake. Oh, what a nice cake! This is a beautiful cake, and this cake, makes us feel good. But we don't have any clue how that cake was baked. And so, going back, I want to talk about nostrums, and this is such a fascinating thing because learning about how these things got started and what was in them, it seems like today that a lot of these things are unvaluable. A lot of our medicines are unvaluable. Like they're never a problem for anybody. Just take them. There's very minimal risk.
Right.
This is what we hear when we go to doctors' offices. This is what we're told. Yeah, there's risk, but it's very minimal. And it
Yeah.
never really gets explored in the doctor's office. So tell
Never.
me about the beginning of nostrums and how they started, why, and what they did for people.
Yeah, I mean, it was what I call the Wild West days of the drug industry. It's the birth of the modern American drug industry takes place at a period when these so-called nostrums, or patent drugs, are being sold in America. And what they are is, this is a time in which you don't need any prescription, so no prescription required. Doctors
Right.
aren't necessary. You're able to walk in if you're 18, some states 16, and buy one of these patent remedies. And they were really cure-alls for the most part. Some were specifically marketed. So one of the biggest sellers was a thing called Cop's King of Baby Soothers. It was you gave it to your newborn baby, your infant, and it wouldn't cry as much at night. It would calm them down. They marketed it by looking in the newspapers for birth announcements. Then they would send a free sample of their remedy to the new mothers. It
Hmm.
turns out that that was one third pure opium. So a number of babies died over time. Cops wasn't around for long. But all of these nostrums are mixed with, many of them are liquid. They're mixed with alcohol. They're mixed with cannabis. They're mixed with cocaine. They're mixed with morphine and opium. And it's the drive and demand for morphine after the Civil War, the Mexican American War and the Civil War, that really gets going the companies that we know by names today. So two young German American cousins in Brooklyn, the Pfizer cousins, Charles
Hmm.
Pfizer being one of them, started up a little company because of the demand for morphine, and they make quality morphine in their manufacturing plant in Brooklyn. Edward Robinson Squibb, the naval captain, knows the demand for high quality painkillers and starts ER Squibb and Sons. Um, Park and Davis is an ex copper miner and a salesman who start Park Davis, and they go into the very same business. Eli Lilly was a former, Union soldier who was able to realize that the worth of turning out this material. And so we see the early days of what I call the companies that we get to know by names. And when I said before what was used in these products, all the different drugs, the pharmaceutical company essentially, Tammy, got its start on addictive drugs. And there's no better example than that, I, what I call the Amazon of its day was the Sears and Roebuck catalog. You could send in $1.50 and get a
Yeah.
small amount of pure cocaine and a syringe. There's nothing wrong in that. Nobody was complaining about it. That's what was being sold. And Bayer, which we all know as Bayer aspirin, one of the best German pharmaceutical companies, over a 5-year period from 1898 to 1903, their laboratory scientists came up with 4 discoveries in the lab. The first one was acetaminophen, which we know as Tylenol,
Right.
a wonder drug.
Hmm.
Next year, they come up with aspirin. also amazing. Then they come up 2 years later with heroin. Yeah, I know that's hard to imagine, but you say what? No,
Just
true.
a
It's,
little heroin in the morning.
yeah, a little heroin, and they named it after the German word for heroisch, which for heroic,
Hmm.
and it was marketed not only for as a baby soother, but as a cure for morphine addiction. They patented that was the patented name for it, and they sold it in America starting in 1900. And in 1903, they came up with the entire class of barbiturates, sort of sedatives, and their brand name was phenobarbital. Now, my favorite footnote in these early days of the pharmaceutical industry is of those four drugs, Tylenol, acetaminophen,
Uh-huh.
aspirin, heroin, and phenobarbital, which was the only one they didn't put on the market? Tylenol, because they thought that was too toxic. It's fantastic to think they thought heroin and phenobarbital were fine without a prescription, but somehow
Right.
Tylenol was too damaging. So it was a strange time in American history, without a doubt. And it goes
Yeah.
all the way to 1914 when we finally passed a law called the Harrison Act. And overnight, all the narcotics are illegal. Then we go into that strange experiment on prohibition, and alcohol is banned, so you lose the base for a lot of the nostrums.
Yeah.
And the pharmaceutical companies go cold turkey. They lose their addictive products, they lose alcohol, and they have to figure out a way forward. And that's really the start of what we view as the modern industry.
That's so interesting. So were those nostrums able to be patented or did the patent stuff come later?
No, so what happened is it's interesting. They were able to be trademarked. So it wasn't that they
Trademark.
were patented. So nobody had an exclusive selling period. What you were really doing is you were competing by saying a bit like the supplement industry today. So if you walk into a vitamin world or walk into a GNC, you're going to see 10 different vitamins that say that they're going to be anti-aging or faster
Mhm.
muscles at the gym or
Right.
weight loss or calm. They'll make you calm, putting you to sleep, and that nobody has a patent on it, but they're all doing different variations of some type of
Like a
root.
proprietary blend?
That's right, and that
Mhm.
now the proprietary part is interesting because in the early days of the pharmaceutical industry, you didn't have to put down as a company what was in your product.
Hmm.
So, Cop's King of Baby Soothers, nobody knew it was a
Oh,
third.
nobody knew it was heroin.
That's right. So you were able to put it out. All they knew is it worked. Did it keep my infant quiet overnight? Oh, yeah. Did it suppress my cough when I had an infection? Yeah, it did. Did it make me feel a little bit happier when I was doing this? Was it a stimulant? So the 1906 is the first federal law that's passed to regulate drugs. It's called the 1906, the Pure Food and Drugs Act. And
Mhm.
what it is, what it requires is nothing about safety. It just requires them to put on the label what's inside. And that's caused because of a nostrum that was put out that was a cough remedy that included an antifreeze chemical. It killed 107 people, including mostly children. So as a result of
Okay.
that, federal government does what it always does, passes a
Right.
law to cover up, for the last
Safety.
big, yeah, and they said now you have to put on your label what's included.
Okay.
So what happened is the first big action they brought. You'll love this. You think they're going to bring an action against somebody for opium or whatever? No, as long as you had it on the label, you were fine. They brought an action against Coca-Cola, claiming, you say it's Coca-Cola, but you don't have anything from the coca plant in it, and it includes caffeine, which isn't on the label. They lost that in court, but that was the first big action the federal government brought in the law.
So was it a myth then? Because I've heard that they used to put cocaine in
They did. So
Coca-Cola.
what happened is, no, 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 you're right, and I have a
Okay.
footnote. You'll love this. There's a footnote about that. So I had to, like, I can't tell you how much time I spent to get that right because there's so much bad information about that.
Yeah.
There was originally on the original formulation of Coca-Cola a bit of the coca plant, so there was a little bit of a stimulant in it. Then the man Pemberton, this Civil War soldier, got addicted to morphine and actually thought Coca-Cola might help uh, get you off of morphine. He bought the rights to Coca Cola. He's the one who made it into the big product that it was later with this guy Chandler. They took the coca out. So
Okay.
by the time the federal government was bringing its action in 1906, there was no coca in it. It had been in before.
Got it. Oh, see how it gets so,
Yeah, that's right.
intertwined? It's like you
The,
really do have to get to
that,
the bottom of the
that,
source.
and that's why, as a matter of fact, Coca Cola added the caffeine in to make up for the loss of the coca.
Mm,
You still get a little bit of a bump in terms of your feeling from it and a little bit of sugar. But
right.
yeah,
Do we
so
know why they took the coca out? Was it getting too expensive to
oh, that's
manufacture?
I wasn't able to find that out because
Mm,
I know it wasn't for moral reasons because everything was being sold at that time.
yeah,
It might have been, and it might have been for manufacturing, and it might have been the difficulty of getting it.
I see. Did people actually know the impact of a word like heroin? Like, would they even know that it was such a like? Obviously, we know now, but did they back then?
No, as a matter of fact, we look at it now and you think, how could anybody have been taking heroin thinking it was
Yeah.
going to cure for something? But you could ask the same question about how we had doctors in the last 20 years prescribing 120 OxyContin pills at the highest
Right.
possible dosage to somebody for back pain. So, and what happens is there's a process that started, I think, in the nostrums, the patent remedies, the heroines, and the cocaine mixtures of the day. The companies themselves sold them as being safe and effective. So they would tell you all the benefits from it, and they would never tell you any of the horror stories. And it was
Right.
only over time that we started to get the evidence of the number of addicts that developed in that. But that was really that was hidden, and people would feel safe about taking it because not only were you told it was safe, the effects felt good for whatever you were taking it for,
Right.
but in addition, you knew so many other people who were taking it. So how
Yes.
could it really be that terrible? And there's also, I think, something that we have as just humans that is how we get in trouble sometimes when it comes to addictive products, even if they're by drug manufacturers. That is the belief that even if you hear that a drug can be addictive, has a downside, you think that you're different. I
Yes.
can handle it. You know what? I won't get addicted. I can control that. I'll just
Right.
take a small amount. And I think the rehab centers are filled with ex addicts who went in with the idea that they were going to be different.
For sure. Well, so the old story of a frog in a pot, right? If you start boiling the water slowly, they don't notice, and
Yeah,
but if you
yeah,
put them right in, they'll jump
yeah,
out.
yeah,
It's a very real thing that we've all experienced it or known someone who in our families we've had some interaction with addiction at this point.
yeah.
Very difficult to find somebody whose family hasn't been impacted by it.
And you mentioned before, you said where the drugs that were being used by these patent remedies or that in the early 1900s, did they have the patents on them? And they didn't, But I think that for anybody who's listening to this who goes out and gets a drug filled at a pharmacy, they'll know the difference between what's a brand name drug or a
Mhm.
generic. And, often you're hoping there's a generic for the drug you have to take because it's going to be a lot cheaper.
Cheaper.
Uh,
Mhm.
but that's because the drug industry created the right to own the brand name, and if they have the brand name and they invent the drug, the way that we worked it out in the U.S. starting after World War II is you could get a 17-year patent, you could get it extended for 20, and you essentially had the right to that product name, and nobody else could put out a generic against it
Right.
until the patent had expired. So that's where you made your big money, and that really happens after World War II with penicillin. Penicillin nobody owns, by the way. That becomes a World War II secret project to get penicillin to the battlefield. And all the drug companies that are made part of this special effort by the federal government have to share their research, and nobody owns the rights to it. So after
Right.
the war, the price for penicillin was super cheap. So what the drug companies did is they looked for variations of antibiotics that were a little bit different in the terms of their molecule makeup. And
Okay.
then they could go and get a patent on that. They could
Mhm.
charge a much higher price, and that's where patents really start to come in, is in the 50s.
Oh, that's very interesting. And I guess the goal with, marketing a drug product is it becomes synonymous with the product, much like Kleenex,
Right.
right? We don't even call, tissue paper anymore. It now becomes Kleenex. And you see that with drugs, right? Like who knows what's in Viagra? But we all
Right.
know Viagra, a blue
That's
pill, you see the commercials for it,
no,
and it
that's
becomes synonymous with the product, and
yeah,
that's probably the goal, right?
yeah, that's absolutely true. And when that happens, the drug company it's a home run for them
Yeah.
because they've able to make it part of the lexicon. I mean, I grew up in an era in which you used to say, "Can I get a Xerox of that?" If you wanted a photocopy, Xerox was so synonymous with making
Yep.
a copy of something, and that's what happens, and it does pass into the lexicon. It happened in the 60s with Valium, which was the winning sort of mild tranquilizer of its day. It's been replaced since then by Xanax. But
Right.
Valium had a hold. It was part of a Rolling Stones song. It was part of a best-selling novel by Jacqueline Suzanne Valley of the Dolls. It was in newspaper articles. People would say, "Take a Valium," or "I need a Valium for this or that,"
Oh,
without
yeah.
even knowing what it was like. Uh,
Yeah.
and that's the type of, I think, drug. You're absolutely right that they're looking for when they are out pushing one.
And I think as consumers, we have to remember too, like, propaganda is not illegal.
Right. The look, there's no doubt about it. Look, one of the things that happens here is very interesting. So this, when you say propaganda and sales and promotion and advertising, these are for-profit companies, and they should be
Yep.
for-profit companies. I understand this is a system we have. They're entitled to a fair profit. They put in a lot of effort on getting the drugs right. There's a line between what I call sometimes that fair profit and the excess profit. That's hard to always figure out, but greed
Right.
comes into it occasionally. But in promotion and marketing of it, it's an odd business because in every other business, the maker of the product, the manufacturer of the product is selling essentially directly to the consumer. We can
Hmm.
walk into a car showroom and buy a car. We can buy tires from Firestone or whatever else, or buy jackets from somebody making them for clothing. But in the pharmaceutical business, they have to sell their product first to a doctor who has to prescribe it to us. We're the consumer, the end patients, but the products that are the most valuable to them, on which they have a patent, those are prescription drugs. And
Hmm.
as a result of that, that's the one they put their research and development into. They get the most money for it. They've got to convince the doctor to write that prescription. And if the doctor's writing one prescription already for a drug for cholesterol or diabetes or high blood pressure,
Hmm.
now as a company, you've got to convince them to change to your new
Change.
product. That's right. And there's an inertia built in. So it was in the 50s and 60s, 70s. Uh, as I say, Arthur Sackler, who's the eldest brother of three psychiatrist brothers, the Sackler family, revolutionized drug marketing. He went to
Hmm.
Pfizer with an antibiotic and said, "You should spend several $1 million on the launch. You should run four-color ads in the Journal of the American Medical Association and all these associations. You should create what are called detail teams, men and women. They were all men then, but send out representatives, sales representatives to doctors to try to convince them to do your drug. Give out gifts, sort of pharmaceutical swag, set up speakers
Incentive.
bureaus where doctors could earn extra money by talking about your drug." And the first reaction that most companies gave him was, "You got to be crazy. Why would we want to spend all that money on advertising to doctors? We do it our way and we still make money." It turned out that
Yeah.
once Pfizer used him, that drug became the best selling antibiotic in the country. And it wasn't very different from any other antibiotic. So they realized that if they did the sales and promotion correctly and aggressively, they could change the way that the drugs are often distributed. And I think that's why we saw more and more of it. And then, of course, in 97, the FDA allowed direct to consumer advertising. We're one of two countries in the world, us and New Zealand,
That's
that
right.
allow us, so you can now turn on the TV and hear about the latest and greatest with a ton of side effects. And, they want, even though we can't go and get the drug without a doctor, they want us to get so interested in a drug that if you have that condition that you're hearing about on TV, you'll go into your doctor and say, "Hey, what about this new purple drug I just read about for allergies? What about that?"
Yeah, I think that's such an important point to make because as a society now, we've almost been conditioned to search for things outside ourselves to make ourselves feel good. So if we're sitting around and we see these commercials on TV, well, this is we're constantly searching for something to fix a problem or to feel better. And so this just is just a perfect little setup, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think there are two things that work on that level. One that definitely works is people like a simple fix. So they
Mhm.
love the idea that there might be one pill that's going to solve their problems. You've
Right.
got high cholesterol, and it really could be dangerous. You've got to stop maybe eating as much sausage as you're doing, as much butter. Hell, that's tough. I'd
That's
rather
right.
take a pill. Uh, and so
Right.
the simple fixes work. My wife Trisha, who works with me, we were talking about her beforehand. She has a history of breast cancer in her family. So when she was getting close to menopause, her doctor wanted to put her on hormone replacement therapy, and the estrogen-based drugs cause an increased incidence in breast cancer, and so it wasn't an option for her. So she ended up coming up with her own. This is not your mother's menopause book. Was her way of passing through menopause by using herbs and black
Right.
cohosh for things like
Yep.
hot flashes, different remedies, but it's a much more difficult process. You have to actually exercise. You have to take all these different
Mhm.
herbs. People would prefer just to pick up one pill and take an HRT pill, and
Right.
that's a very seductive thing that pharma has going for it. What
Yep.
I call the easy pill fix,
Right.
and they also have something with the advertisements on television. Tammy, I think that's interesting. Is if you listen to them, as we all do, and you hear the list of side effects, you think, "Why would anyone take that?" But
Right.
the drug companies have done their own internal studies, and I report some of this in the book, in which they believe now we've become immune, not immune, it's the wrong word. We've become so accustomed to hearing the litany of
Yeah.
side effects on each and every drug that we almost tune out. That there are people who listen to it and it says this drug, and it says it's going to change your life. You see people around a barbecue and they're enjoying
Yep.
everything they possibly want. And I've got my cholesterol under control. And then by the time they get to the 14 things that may in fact kill you, you've already tuned out. You've written down the name and you're ready to ask your doctor for that pill the next day.
Yeah. And those side effects generally aren't listed again when you get to the doctor's office.
So two things have happened. Managed care has worked to the detriment of really having a discussion with your doctor about whether a pill works or not.
That's right.
Doctors have trouble keeping up with all the different studies on every new pill, and more pills. And you see this. You saw it in the book when Hoffman LaRoche was the company that had Valium and Librium. They made Valium the biggest selling drug in the world for 15 years, and they did that by something very smart that all drug companies have done since. They used to be that if you had, let's say, a high blood pressure medication as a drug company, you went to cardiologists.
Hmm.
Now, if you were dealing with a drug that might have something to do with diabetes, you were going to doctors who dealt with diabetes.
Right.
If you had a pain pill that you thought might be useful on surgeries that might happen after an orthopedic surgery, you'd be dealing with orthopedic surgeons. Hoffman LaRoche said, if we sell this mild tranquilizer anti-anxiety pill Valium only through psychiatrists, we aren't going to sell very many. We've
Right.
got to get it prescribed by primary care doctors, general practitioners. Even though that's not their specialty, they can
Right.
still prescribe it. And we now know that most pills, whether for chronic conditions like blood pressure, diabetes, or heart disease, are prescribed not by specialists, but by, in fact, primary care doctors. And the same with
Right.
Valium and Xanax and pain
Yep.
pills as well. They can't keep up with the flood of information. And to the extent that they prescribe a pill to you, you're right. They don't highlight each and every one of the side effects because they tend to think those only happen in a few instances and the odds are it's going to be fine for you.
Yeah.
And that's a
It
big gamble.
Yeah, it is a big gamble, and the accessibility of these pills, at your general practitioner's office is pretty frightening, really, because there's demographics, especially women, if you get to a certain point and say you're going through a divorce or going through hard times and you're feeling sad, you mention that to your doctor and it's instantaneous.
Well, it's one of the things, and I have a chapter in there called Targeting Women. One of the things that
Mhm.
Patricia was most incensed on when she was doing the research with me was the effort in the 60s and 70s. And then you see it in medicine in general, but this was its most outrageous. So you have Valium being marketed, and here it is. It's a mild tranquilizer. It becomes this enormous seller, and it becomes the Arthur Sackler, the person who's promoting it, and Hoffman LaRoche make it the first $100 million drug in drug industry history and the first $1 billion drug. And they do it based upon stereotypical advertisements to men and women that were very different. There were these experiments done by the US Army, Walter Reed, in which they took two monkeys and they strapped them into a machine and their hands were essentially free. They'd zap their feet with an electric current and they put next to one of the monkeys a little lever. If that monkeys are pretty smart, if it learned to operate the lever, it would stop the electric zap to both of them. So pretty quickly, that monkey, what they call the
Right.
executive monkey, operated the lever and stopped the zaps. When they would do the autopsies later on those monkeys, it turns out that what the so-called executive monkey operating the lever had ulcers, would have sort of a buildup of calcium inside the arteries, all of these types of what they viewed as diseases from stress and
Right.
problems of operating that. The non-executive monkey didn't have ulcers and other problems. So Sackler and Hoffman LaRoche said, okay, the executive monkey, that's men. They have to go out and they have to be the breadwinners. They have to look tough for all the world. They have to bring
Mhm.
the money home and never show any weakness. Their risk is getting ulcers. So we sell Valium and other mild tranquilizers to them as an aid for business. Women, on the other hand, they're neurotic and hysterical. And we sell it to them so they can be better housewives. And when you hear that, you think it can't be true. But I have advertisements in which their most successful ad to push Valium was a young girl, they said 35, neurotic and single. She was neurotic because she couldn't find someone to marry.
Right.
And what she needed was not somebody to marry, but Valium. There are instances in which somebody's doing faster housework with a vacuum and should be on Adderall. And this type of what I call sexist marketing, which seems so heavy handed to us today,
Yeah.
worked at a time in the 1960s when 95% of doctors were men. So therefore,
Right.
they almost bought into it. And the success of it was that Valium, which becomes this best-selling drug for 15 years, about 66 to 70% of the prescriptions every year, depending on the year, are to women. And
Right.
they are given it just as you said. You walk in, and you say, I'm having trouble in the marriage, I have a divorce or whatever else, and they're being prescribed immediately this prescription. And
Yeah.
it was
Oh,
a
I've
bad.
heard the stories. I've begged friends of mine to try some other things first. But that's how easy it is for people to just, and I understand the want to feel better, of course, but I think we need to change the way we think about how we heal in this country, right? We're not healing when we're covering up our symptoms.
No, you're absolutely right. We're not about wellness. We're about
Right.
fixing the what's wrong or feels wrong. And it's very interesting you say that. But I think that there's another benefit that pharmaceutical companies have figured out. And I say this in a broad brush because not all of them are doing this,
Right, of course.
but they realize that, and doctors realize this, that no doctor and no pharmaceutical company is saying to a physician, by the way, if you have somebody who comes in and says, my life is topsy-turvy, my child has just been diagnosed with cancer, and we're going to be going to St. Jude's for cancer treatment, I'm very stressed out. No
Right.
one says, oh, by the way, I'd like to give you a little anti-anxiety pill. It'll help you at this time. And you might be on it for the next 10 years. You might become
Right.
physically addicted to it. You might become a slobbering idiot at some point because you need more of it than your body can take. It's going to hurt your kidneys and your liver. They
Mhm.
say, I can give you something that'll help you, and you only need it temporarily. It'll help you get over this hump. It'll
Right.
help you get through this period. So
Right.
they give it to you as though it's a band-aid. And I
Right.
think, that we used to hear about heroin being sold on the street by gangs. They'd give you a free sample of heroin so you could come back and get more, and then they would start charging you. But
Right.
I don't mean to say it in that nefarious way, but it's never marketed as though we're looking at this for years. We're looking at this for lifetime. We're looking at you on this for a while. It's always marketed as a
Right.
temporary band-aid. And who
Right.
could say no to a band-aid?
Right. But in reality, we've got people who've been on antidepressants for 20 years and more. And
A-
and and this is a real concern now because as we're seeing, it's kind of timelined out. We're seeing more people having been on antidepressants for so long. So we're actually starting to see the results of that
So
now. They weren't there before.
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There are a couple of interesting things that happened with Valium. It happened with Xanax. It's happening with the SSRIs and antidepressants. The and antidepressants made a dent into the Valium market in some ways because doctors started to say, "Oh, well, we have this SSRI, this new type of antidepressant, which has no side effects. You'll be fine on it." And remember, drugs are approved through the FDA on studies that are done for safety for a limited amount of time.
Mhm.
So the best the doctors can say is that there are these side effects if you're on this for 9 months to a year. They don't know what the cumulative side effects will be in 5 years or 10 years down the road.
Right.
Um, and that happened, for instance, on the birth control pill, the very
Mhm.
first oral contraceptive put out in 1960, turns out to be a drug that the FDA approves. There was a lot of concern about approving, and not just for the religious objections, but for the
Right.
fact that the FDA was approving a drug for the first time that you didn't have to be sick to take. There's no
Right.
illness or anything else. You were as a lifestyle drug. You were able to
That's
take it
right.
to
Lifestyle drug.
right, a choice
Yes.
over. And for the pharmaceutical industry, this is a holy grail. This is the idea that they might be able to come up with a so-called happy pill that you wouldn't have to be sick to take, but you'd want to take every day to feel better about life.
Mhm.
That's fantastic. So on the oral contraceptive, it was approved because of the way it had been studied for no more than 2 years. So no one could
Mhm.
stay on it for more than 2 years. Well, nobody paid attention to that. Women
No,
were on that, were on. It took
and still
15,
don't.
yeah, and still don't. It took 15 years to find out that the early pills that were being marketed by Cyril had such high doses of estrogen they were causing blood clots and leading to endometrial cancer. So women were essentially experiment victims on that.
Mhm.
They were their own
Right.
ongoing health and safety study, and that's certainly the case on SSRIs and antidepressants for two reasons. Not only are people on them for much longer than drug companies had first tested them, but in addition, they are overprescribed. And I say that in the sense that antidepressants can be effective for somebody who has clinical depression, can't get out of bed, and
Yes.
is contemplating
Yep.
suicide, but they're
Mhm.
given for too easily to somebody who comes in and says, I'm blue and down, and what do I do? And at a very
Right.
young age, often.
Right, right. And that's a good example that you use there. It's supposed to be used to kind of get you out of this hole, like a boost out of this hole when it comes to depression. I had a doctor on from a holistic center who treats depression with microdosing. And it's the same kind of effect is the hope is to kind of jolt the person out of clinical depression so that then they can start eating properly, sleeping better, trying to maintain some kind of schedule that promotes healthy, habits and get to a healthy place mentally through their lifestyle. That's sustainable. Whereas when you're taking these drugs, ultimately it's not sustainable because you're going to have the fallout from the drugs as well.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. It's like a hammer, and you're right. In homeopathic looks at these little micro doses often to try to build up the body's own natural ability to fight something. And pharmaceuticals come in like a hammer.
Right.
They come in as a sledge, and they can be effective, but they also can, for somebody who really doesn't need them, they do cause additional problems. And I think that one of the things that happens is the you take a drug, let's say like an antidepressant that is effective and useful for somebody with clinical depression, and then it
Hmm.
tends to be overprescribed to a larger group. The same thing happens with painkillers. I
Yep.
mean, the predecessor to OxyContin was a long-acting, slow-release morphine tablet that had been invented by the Sacklers British company for end-of-life terminal cancer pain. So
Gosh.
people in hospice in England, where hospice first started, could go home from the hospital and die at home. So instead of being in the hospital where you had to get pain relief every 4 to 6 hours, you can
Right.
go home and get it every 12 hours. You can give it to yourself. It didn't have to be in an IV and intravenously. You could take it as a pill. Now, when it comes out in America as an extended release opioid, it can be helpful for that type of terminal end of life pain and for severe pain after surgery, but you end up getting doctors prescribing it for ingrained back pain, for osteoarthritis, for things for which it's not approved. Like SSRIs and antidepressants, it gets overprescribed for things far down from the original purpose and then starts to create problems. And I
Right.
think this is, happens time and time again. The history of the pharmaceutical industry, as you know from reading the book, is riddled with instances in which a new drug comes out. It's the wonder drug.
Yep.
Everybody starts to do it. Then it's become so popular that it gets abused a little bit. And then it
Hmm.
starts to end up, then magazine articles appear that maybe it really has addictive side effects or is causing problems. And
Right.
then eventually, when the Congress has Senate hearings on it and the FDA cracks down on it and says you can't give prescriptions on it anymore, it doesn't end forever abuse problems. It creates the door for a new drug
New
to
one.
come. So,
That's right.
um, you have Valium and Librium, but you also had them replaced in part by so-called rainbow pills, diet pills. The
Hmm.
pain clinics of the 2000s that we've seen were diet centers of the 60s and 70s, where somebody would go in and get the equivalent of an
Fascinating.
amphetamine pill to lose weight.
Fen-phen. I remember the fen-phen boom.
Fen was the big, and
Yeah.
it caused heart problems afterwards because nobody realized you couldn't combine these two.
Yep.
Life magazine sent out a reporter to 10 weight loss clinics, a thin reporter who did not need to lose a pound. And she was prescribed 1,500 amphetamine pills by those 10 clinics. So it was a pretty good sign that something was wrong. So,
Right.
and then they cracked down on that. Eventually
Yeah.
that was cracked down on, and something
Right.
else becomes the wonder drug.
Right. But it's our responsibility as consumers to keep these companies in check, right? Like, why do we forget? Why do we forget the Vioxxes? Why do we forget the fen-phens? Why do we forget this so easily?
Yeah, that's the part that I think is so fascinating to me, because when you mentioned Vioxx, it's a perfect example, or the fen-phens, or for instance, hormone replacement with Premarin, what was being
Yep.
done by Cyril, or the first oral contraceptives, and with OxyContin as well with Purdue. One of the things that makes me particularly angry is that these companies receive the reports coming in as adverse impact reports from the field.
Yep.
They would get them from distributors, they would get them from pharmacists that something was wrong, they would hear that there was a problem. And they aren't legally obligated to report them to the government unless it hits this serious level. There's some discretion allowed. And there are instances in which they just buried those adverse serious impact results because they didn't think that they were able to sort of be in denial for themselves. So, for
Mhm.
instance, on the pill causing blood clots and cancer,
Yeah.
that was hidden for nearly a decade before it came out. The same on Premarin when Cyril was marketing HRT that was causing breast cancer, hidden for nearly 15 years. Vioxx, a company put out by Pfizer being one of the best of the companies in the business, run by doctors for a long time. Vioxx was its first big scandal, but why it was so terribly embarrassing and humiliating for Pfizer was the extent to which, when the lawsuits were filed, they had information that should have raised 100 red flags over there, and instead of acting, they dragged their feet. This is
Yep.
public health. They
Yep.
have an obligation. Look, they make billions of dollars on these
Yep.
drugs. That's fine. But they have an obligation, I believe, when they see that the drug might be reacting in the field differently than they expected, to actually be the ones to come forward and be the first to expose it, because they have the earliest information, but they aren't. And that, I think, is infuriating. We do forgive them. We go on to the next drug,
Yeah.
and forget about the last one and assume that that's just the way that happens. Then we hear that they paid a multi-billion-dollar fine and think, okay, that'll punish them. But I will tell you that for the most part, the big fines, and they're enormous, they are part of doing business for the
Yeah,
drug
it's a
companies.
business decision.
That's right.
They literally weigh out, well, we'll pay this much out in fines and then we can still be profitable.
That's
That's
right.
how the decisions are made.
Look at it's. I mean, most of the companies. So Purdue, which marketed OxyContin, is unusual because it's a privately held company owned by a family. Well, that family, by the way, they sold from 1996 to 2019. The last year they were full sales, $35 billion in sales on OxyContin, and it made that family one of the wealthiest in America. They made Forbes' richest families list in 2015 with an estimated $14 billion net worth based upon one drug, a one-hit wonder. That's unusual. Most of these companies are big public companies, and as a result, they have to perform every quarter for their investors, the stock
Mhm.
market. The investors are looking for returns, and you're
Right,
right. They're calculating everything out, not just for the next 3 months, 6 months. They're looking at 5-year plans and 6-year plans and what's in
right.
the pipeline and what their fines might be. They have it well figured.
How do you weigh out, though, your fiduciary responsibilities to your stakeholders versus human life?
Yeah, well, it's to me you can't, and
No.
that's why. So if you said to me, "What would you like to see occasionally?" and this is my big wish list, I'd like to see occasionally when the line is really crossed, and it has been crossed sometimes. Prosecutors who aren't just looking for a big fine, but are considering criminal prosecutions.
Mm.
And they've done that recently on a company that had a fentanyl product called INSYS, INSYS. Its CEO and 5 executives have gone to prison just a few months ago. That CEO had become a billionaire, John Kapoor, based upon that one product. But
Yeah.
their marketing, they bribed doctors to actually write a product that should have been end of life for a whole host of non-serious causes. That was so egregious, the government was able to charge them with crimes and get convictions on them. And I will tell you, that scares the hell out of drug executives. The idea that they don't just have to write a check, that doesn't just hurt the bottom
Oh,
line.
yeah.
They can't go to the country club any longer and hold their face up without being ashamed.
Right.
So if there were occasionally criminal prosecutions of the most egregious cases, you might get better behavior. Now it's terrible to have to think that you actually have to have the threat of prison
Yeah.
to force, due diligence and good behavior. But it's a
But if you have a
factor.
money machine, which is essentially what they have going there, a money machine that just keeps printing, 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 what threat is it really to lose money when you
Yeah,
can just make more? No big
yeah.
deal.
That's and one of the things that anybody who has any doubt about the extent to which this is a money machine. One of my favorite things is in the '60s, in which a company is looking at. And I write about this from some internal documents, looking at the side effects for a drug that they are putting out. Okay, so the
Mm.
drug's going to be heavy on the kidneys, and it might cause water retention, and it could lead to headaches. They viewed that as a gateway drug, meaning that they thought the drug was very effective, for instance, for cholesterol. But to the extent that it had these side effects, they should have drugs in their pipeline to deal with those
Oh,
side. So maybe a water pill to help you get rid of the water, maybe an actual
oh.
prescription pill to get rid of the possibilities that it could trigger migraines. So imagine that if you had a blockbuster drug, you have Viagra out, for instance, and
Mhm.
you say, Viagra, I hear that causes headaches. So let's also get a headache product in the pipeline. It's really remarkable to think that not only are you aware of the side effects, but you want to actually make money off of them.
Well, and I personally don't think that that is a one off that happens with this or that pill. I think that's probably more of a business model, especially when I don't know if you're familiar with black box drugs warnings.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So a lot of people weren't. We actually talked about it here on the podcast at one time and I got phenomenal feedback from and I didn't know what they were. The general population doesn't. A black box warning drug is a drug that's only supposed to be used very temporarily. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So wait, think of this. The FDA puts a black box warning on a drug, and that means that something really untoward is happening with that drug. It is dangerous. It should be released and prescribed only in situations in which it's absolutely necessary. So you
Mhm.
would think that would change the entire dispensing history of a drug. And
You
guess
would
what?
think.
You would think. And OxyContin, the drug that many people know, the most used part of the opioid crisis, helped to fuel it, got a black box warning. In
Mm.
2019, 18, no. In 2001, how about that? And by all the
Wow.
way back when we changed the label. So black box warning goes on, and guess what? It doesn't affect the
Anything.
prescribing at all. As a matter of fact, it goes up and up and up after that. Because what happens is the black box warning is available and seen by pharmacists and by doctors.
Right.
You, as the patient, when you go in to get a prescription filled, you get usually just a written prescription. Now they'll call it in, or they'll send it in by email to your local pharmacy at CVS, Walmart, or wherever. But you don't see the box. You don't
No.
see the black box warning. You
Mm-mm.
don't see what the FDA puts on it with the
That's right.
warning about how scary it is. Unless your doctor tells you about it, which they don't. We talked before about it. They don't tell you much about it.
Yep.
And what doctor is going to say to you, by the way, I'm going to prescribe this pill to you, and I want you to know the FDA has put a black box warning on it about how
Yes.
dangerous it is. You're going to say no thanks.
Yep.
So the consumer, the patient, the person who ends up using it is unaware of it for the most part.
Yep. Absolutely. And we're seeing that, especially in women, because a lot of the newer um, birth control products have black box warnings. And I'll tell you from just anecdotal, and this is anecdotal, I'm telling you that upfront. I don't know anyone who has taken the shot for birth control that has had positive outcome with it.
The And you mean positive outcome in terms of not having side effects,
Side
not
effects.
you're not necessarily having children. You mean
Right,
they?
right, side effects.
Okay,
Yep,
okay,
that's exactly what I'm talking about.
yeah.
Side
So
effects.
yeah,
And odd ones that may not be correlated with the shot. You wouldn't think of it. Oh, that can't be that.
yeah, very interesting. So I think what happens is two things. First of all, the black box warnings. There was a time in which pharmaceutical companies fought those black box warnings. They didn't want them because they
Mm,
viewed it as a death knell for a drug. They thought it would really be terrible because doctors wouldn't prescribe it.
right.
Now they realize that there are so many of them, not that it's not across the board, but that if in the given area, like in birth control, there are a few that have black box warnings, it doesn't necessarily mean the end of prescribing. And Purdue showed that with
Right.
OxyContin. In addition, some of them don't mind it because it gives them a bit of liability protection, possibly, because you put a black box warning on
Ah,
it. Now you're able to say before a court eventually, look, the FDA knew that this was a drug that should not be widely distributed. We had a black box warning on it. The people who should be responsible are the doctors who may have been giving it without carefully assessing their patients. But we told the doctors in all of our 22-page
right.
foldout about the warnings. We carried on and did
Right.
our due diligence, and therefore they try to absolve it and move it on to the doctors, even though they have salespeople in there telling them, by the way, this is really good to prescribe all the time. So
Right.
the black box warning is what I call a bit of cover your behind that they've tried to institute. Doesn't always work for them.
Right.
And it's not that they get one, they don't want one, but when they
Right.
get one from the FDA, gives them a little bit of liability protection, possibly. One last thing on this. Everybody should remember that when you get a drug prescribed to you, even if the company has done its best to
Hmm.
have extensive, clinical trials, stage 1, 2, and 3, and it's shown to be fairly safe, they have done that drug on its own without any other drug in your system. They're taking people
Right.
so now there are very
With
few
people
people.
who are in great shape,
That's
right?
right. Yeah, that's right. And so now very few people take just one drug. It's time you start to get prescriptions. You might have a drug for blood pressure. You might have one for some people have them for chronic diabetes, and somebody else is taking one for headaches, for migraines. Now you start to mix the drugs. Nobody's testing how they react with each other.
Right.
So the side effects of a drug that do not seem that terrible could be exacerbated, hastened, worsened, or put on steroids essentially by
Hmm.
the synergy with another drug. And who is testing that? We
Right.
are, the patients. We're paying to be the test sort of, guinea pigs by eventually the drug companies will know that this birth control pill, when mixed with that anti-diabetes drug, is really a lethal combination. And how do we know that? Because people who were taking the two ended up getting very sick. That's
Right.
unfortunate, but that's the way it's done.
Wow. That's again personal responsibility, right? I don't know. I'm not saying that they should get off with no consequence whatsoever or whatever, but the only way we're going to stop this type of practice is by knowledge, getting knowledge ourselves, and then changing the way we do our doctor's visits. Does this
Yeah,
does this
I
drug
agree.
does this drug have a black box warning?
Me. And
You know?
if you ask those questions, your doctor will be absolutely startled.
I know.
I mean, I know that when Trisha, my wife, went to her doctor and he tried to write a prescription for hormone replacement therapy, and she said
Hmm.
no.
No.
He
Yeah.
was sort of startled because nobody said no. They just didn't do it. And then he gave her a long litany of why that was a terrible decision and why it was terrible. Recently, a doctor had suggested for her that she should be on a drug to help build bones. And she said no.
No.
And the doctor sort of said no. And then she gave the reasons why. She didn't think that that was a good drug because there are a lot of side effects. And she was going to try instead exercise and other things that might build bones. Look, it takes more work to be an informed consumer.
Yep.
If you are an informed consumer, it's good. It doesn't necessarily mean, and you'll get this, Tammy, you might ask your doctor questions about if that has a black box warning. And maybe that doctor will be so persuasive that she will be able to convince you that notwithstanding the black box warning, for instance, on that birth control pill,
Hmm.
it's still worthwhile for X, Y, and Z. And you'll
Right.
walk out of the office with the prescription and feel all right, but you'll have made that decision
Yes.
yourself.
Informed consent.
That's right.
Yep. And that's what we really are talking about here today on this podcast. It's not about who's right and who's wrong, or it shouldn't be available. I believe in freedom of choice for everyone. But when you don't have informed consent, you can't possibly be making the right decision when you don't have all the facts.
So, and one of the things here, what fits into that point that you're making is this is why personally, I don't say it in the book because I keep my opinion out of the chapters. I let the readers draw their conclusions. But
Yep.
personally, I think it was a mistake when the FDA in '97 opened up direct to consumer advertisement. I think
Yep.
it's a mistake that we have it and New Zealand has it
Yep.
because it doesn't add to our information about a drug. It's a sales pitch.
Yep.
We're getting sold the idea of what a drug might be.
Yep.
And to that extent, it makes it easier for us not to be informed consumers. Don't ask the question because you think you know something because you've seen ads about it.
Right.
And we are often told by American drug companies, the biggest pharma companies say we have to charge such high prices because we have so much money spent on research and development. We spend billions on a new drug and it takes a lot of money to bring it back. Well,
Yeah.
as I always say, in the last 10 years, if you take the 10 biggest drug companies, they spend more on average every year on promotion and marketing and stock buybacks than they do on research and development. So
Yeah.
and they aren't spending money on promotion and marketing because they think it's a waste of money. They
Right.
know
They know
it's
it
good.
works.
That's right. And they're advertising a new drug heavily enough. They see the response to it in terms of the public and doctors writing the prescriptions. And how much of that is informed, I don't know. But I just think that we don't need to have consumers being bombarded with Madison Avenue ads telling them why a drug may be effective.
Agreed. Agreed. And moving along to what we're facing today in terms of a COVID vaccine, we're already seeing marketing for that. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm already seeing marketing for that. I'm seeing ads in a hotel I was staying at over the weekend about being safe and protecting others, and people wearing masks in the advertisement. And we're already being prepared for the vaccine rollout. Before we get into the COVID vaccine itself, I want a little bit of history about what happened in the 70s with the pig flu vaccine. Because when I was reading your book, I really saw a lot of parallels here. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that for us?
Lucky for politicians and for drug executives that we all have a short memory in this
Yeah.
country. But for those who do remember the swine flu vaccine, this fiasco in 1976, Gerald Ford was president. There were some cases of the swine flu at Fort Dix, a couple of soldiers, and there was a tremendous fear in the federal government because that's the same exact flu that had sort of been the 1918 swine flu that spread around the world, a great
Right.
epidemic. We were afraid it was coming out again. So the government authorized, based upon those few cases, a national vaccination program. Sound familiar? Vaccines
Mhm.
going to be rolled out for everybody. In this case, 4 pharmaceutical companies were chosen. They were able to go on a crash program. Because they already had the swine flu out before, they had a head start as opposed to COVID, where they have to start on a new virus from start. So
Right.
here they were able to come up with the vaccine. They're ready to roll it out. They make 100 million doses. And the federal government says, okay, we're ready, give it to us. And what do the drug companies do? They say in unison, nope, not so fast. We want to be guaranteed a reasonable profit. Those were the words used. Reasonable means something different to them than it might mean to you and to me.
Right.
And we want full exemption from any liability for anything that this vaccine might do to people who get it in large numbers. And the
Mhm.
federal government gave in on both. It needed the vaccine. 40 million people got inoculated before, where they finally canceled the program because swine flu didn't spread out of Fort Dix. It really wasn't happening.
Right.
And unknown to everybody was a small neurological rare syndrome, Guillain-Barré, which is debilitating. 4,000 people ended up with that out of 40 million. Yes, a very small number, but if you got it, it was devastating. It changed your life
Yep.
and the life of your family.
Yep.
And that's the risk for any vaccine. Sometimes, no matter how safe it shows in clinical trials, because there are a limited number of people, you're talking 100,000, eighty
Yep.
thousand. When you start to
Again,
give it,
very healthy people they're demonstrating these on.
yeah, that is often the case. And you find that once you start to give it to a much larger patient population, it's not always so clear as to what the side effects may be. So the swine flu for me is a perfect example of how the federal government gets played by the pharmaceutical companies in
Mhm.
times of a health crisis. Pharma gets in the driver's seat by coming up with a product that everyone wants, including the
Yep.
government, and then it sort of dictates a little bit of pricing and liability concerns. And that's playing out in slow motion in COVID as well.
Yeah. And the caveat to that story too is that Ford was not in popularity at that time. Is that correct?
Yeah, very interesting. So Ford wasn't popular, and you know what? The that entire thing in 1976, for people to know presidential election years, comes in a presidential election year. So
Hmm.
presidential in an election year for the presidency, they say everything's about politics times two. Everything's about politics, and so Gerald Ford was looking at what was happening. He's got Jimmy Carter that he's running against, but he's also getting challenged by Ronald Reagan in the early primaries. He wants to look as though he's a take charge president. So he's putting through the vaccine program very early on and giving the green light to that. As a matter of fact, there are very famous pictures that are published of Gerald Ford getting one of the very first vaccination shots.
Really?
He gets it, and the person's giving him the vaccination shot, and it shows that it's safe. Now, of course, if you roll up 1976 to 2020, Twitter, Facebook, and everything else, what would be happening 10 minutes after Donald Trump would be getting the first vaccination shots? There would be people saying, oh, it was a fake shot. There was nothing in it. I'm sure it was a dummy shot. No one's saying that about Ford at the time. Nobody doubted it was a
Right.
real vaccine. But today,
Right.
people are so cynical, they would be doubting the president was really getting a shot.
Yeah,
But
yeah, that's so true. That is so true. So, where do you think this is going with COVID? So we have these mandates in place now, which I think are undemocratic because we've had we're almost in the seventh month now of this emergency crisis, and we know it's more than a 99% survival rate. We have all this data in, and we still have not had any kind of democratic vote, any kind of democratic discussion. We haven't been able to cross examine any experts about whether a mask works or it doesn't work. And this thing is just marching down the trail.
yeah, it is. I think that, I mean, two things happen. And, I mentioned before to you that I had this second last chapter called The Coming Pandemic. And I understood a, in a sense that these doctors were predicting that there would be a bacteria or a virus that would one day be the next pandemic. It was a matter of time. It comes out every generation or two. What I didn't appreciate and understand until we fell into COVID was the degree of panic, the degree of how the after effect. I was looking at just from a medical point of view. How do you treat
Mhm.
it? Where's the money to be made? But
Yep.
forget it. There's a fear level that takes place. And when that fear level starts to spread and people are afraid, governments can come in and do one of two things. They can come in and not mandate and have a little bit looser. Sweden tried that. The death rate was higher than their neighboring countries, but they had a higher death rate, certainly on elderly. Or the government can come in and mandate. And the nanny state, as I call it, the
Hmm.
government that's going to tell you what to do, will come in and err on the side of overly restrictive,
Right.
because they can't go wrong with overly restrictive, except they can, because they've now learned that if they close everything down, the economy stops working and it puts the red lights on completely. But if they mandate masks, even though many people aren't going to wear them, they can't enforce it. But if they mandate masks, then they can't, nobody can say to you later, well, you should have had mask on. Because when that debate is held, let's assume that masks are held not to be as effective as some proponents believe.
Hmm.
Then the government says, well, the worst thing was we had you wear them for 9 months or a year. It wasn't the end of the world. But if masks should ever be shown to be effective and the
Mm.
government didn't take the most draconian position, then
Right.
somebody's going to say, you let people die. And that's what happens, I think, on the vaccine. This
Hmm.
is, I know this sounds very cold hearted, and I don't mean it this way, but there are individuals in the drug industry, this is their
Mhm.
business, who
Yep.
view COVID-19 as one of the biggest m- profitable money makers in a
Opportunity.
generation
Yeah.
for them, because we're talking about a vaccine, and this was with all the companies. And I'm staying in touch with the infectious disease experts who are following these vaccines. And I don't care if you're talking about Pfizer, Johnson and Johnson, the any of them through this group.
Mhm.
None of them are coming up with a vaccine that's like the polio vaccine, that's 97, 98% possibly effective. You take it one shot and you develop some resistance to polio. It
Right.
drops down. They're talking about vaccines that have a level of effectiveness from the FDA of 50%. That's all. On a good year, an
Wow.
influenza vaccine will have a 70% effective rate. So 1 out of 2 people have to develop antibodies to COVID. And those who develop antibodies, we don't know how long those will last. 4 months, 6 months, a year. Will there be T cell reactions as well, which help make you a little bit stronger for the reaction? Possibly. Some of them may
Mhm.
have that. But the great thing here is pharma's essentially going to be selling a vaccine, and there will be a number of them. There will be one over the finish line, and then a few others will follow fairly closely
Right.
that will need booster shots. So you'll take it. And a little bit like the influenza vaccine, you'll have to go back in a year or 16 months, or if there's an outbreak. Governments will have to stockpile it in case there's a surge in their particular country. So this is a line of revenue for billions of dollars
Mhm.
that pharma companies had never had before. And
Right.
COVID is undoubtedly a big moneymaker for them.
Yeah. And going back to what we said before, they start marketing drugs for side effects of drugs. And there's that whole other piece. There's a whole other piece here where, like a black box drug warning that we don't know about, there's inserts on these vaccines that we never see. And, I personally have a story where my son was injured by a vaccine, a flu shot. He got ITP from a flu
Mm.
shot. At the time, I had no idea that ITP was a side effect of a flu shot. Now, a simple Google search will bring it up. It's one of the most paid out cases in vaccine court is for ITP.
Yes, but what's interesting is I'm sorry to hear that about your son. He's fine, right?
Yes, he did recover.
The what you said at the end, the last 2 words, vaccine court, because
Mhm.
a lot of people don't realize that the drug companies, to sort of bundle up their vaccine, were able to get laws passed that essentially have taken all childhood vaccines, which are their big money makers for the most part, and
Mhm.
made sure that they can't get sued directly for those types of problems. You have to go before the vaccine court. You can opt out and go to a private suit, but it's very expensive. It takes a
Right.
long time. You're unlikely to win.
Yep.
Um, and so you get bundled up into a system that they have the control over, in which they really are able to control it. And
Mhm.
I think that, one of the things that will happen and has happened is vaccines. There was a time, and we talk about this after swine flu and with some failed cases on Lyme disease and some others, that vaccines were down to only a couple of manufacturers because pharmaceutical companies said, you know what, it's not worth it. Too many headaches, too many lawsuits.
Mhm.
We have to deal with the governments and everything else. But then some clever ones, Aventis and others, some of the French companies, they started to figure out ways to make it an annual source of revenue. Childhood vaccines
Mhm.
increase the number that were being given. They know new births are coming all the time. They made it part of
Mhm.
the process. They struck their deals. They came up with the special court exemptions. And I think that vaccines are a standalone part of the pharmaceutical industry now. That people often go in. Look at how many times do you go past your local retail pharmacy chain? We have CVS and Walgreens here. They're pushing the flu vaccine from
Yep.
August on.
I have
The
the tiniest little grocery store in my town, and there's a big sandwich board outside that says, don't forget to get your flu shot."
Yeah, no, it's really remarkable. So I
Yeah.
mean, they've made it part and parcel of and that. Think of this from the perspective of a pharmaceutical company. If you're manufacturing a vaccine and you
Mhm.
want it out, you
Mhm.
want it at your local grocery store in your town,
Yep.
where they say, "Don't forget your flu shot," because that almost nothing else that you can imagine like that. No doctor's prescription needed. You can
Yeah.
just go in and get it.
Walk in and get it. And these side effects, they're debatable. And I understand they're doing their best to disprove that vaccines cause side effects, right? So, but they have been attributed to allergies, gut issues, IBS, things that we wouldn't normally think would be attributed to a vaccine because we get a vaccine and then we're fine. We don't see anything happen right away. It takes a little bit of time for something to happen, and then, conveniently it's forgotten and it's not linked in that. And
Yeah.
I'm not an anti-vaxxer by any means. I understand how vaccines work, how they've improved our quality of life and all of that. But what I am concerned about is the fact that these vaccines have not been safety tested for over 30 years, and these companies have absolutely no liability because of the 1986 Act that they passed, where we now get payout through vaccine court or the countermeasures program,
Right.
where people get paid out, and it's all from our taxpayer money.
No, it's fantastic. Taxpayers are paying for it. They don't even
Yeah.
realize but it's something very interesting what you said a moment ago, and I view this as sort of a researcher and looking at the history here as you lay this out on vaccines. So
Hmm.
the big case that everybody focused on was this incident in England where Dr. Wakefield and 11 fellow doctors in
Yeah.
had come up with an incident in which they linked vaccines being given, these MMR vaccines, to
Hmm.
autism in children.
Yep.
And that got the headlines immediately and became a flashpoint in pharma. Well, it turns out that Dr. Wakefield, in his public talks and in his lectures, went beyond what the science said in the Lancet article. He was more of a proponent, after a while, a true believer that it was
Right.
absolutely there as opposed to a casual link. And then it turned out that they had gone to select their samples from lawyers in Britain who were representing children who had suits already against vaccine companies, and the figures may have been skewed. So all of the doctors except for Dr. Wakefield actually rescinded and retracted the article. The Lancet took it out. He got struck off the medical register. Now,
Right.
that being said, that doesn't mean A, he
Right.
can't be right, or B, that vaccines can't be bad for you. But what happened is pharma took that, and you can imagine what they do. They're paying tens of millions of dollars for promotion. They use that like a hammer. So
Yep.
every time somebody comes up and says, by the way, I think there's a link between vaccines and X, Y, or Z,
They
they say,
point to
oh,
that study.
they
They
point to that
point to
study.
that.
And there's also something else that's interesting. A lot of the people at the front, then you do have pure anti-vaxxers who say it's never valid, never good, never worthwhile at any time, no matter what.
Right.
And that's the extreme. And some Hollywood celebrities have become active in being anti-vaxxers. So the drug industry tries to say, oh, here's what it is. It's Wakefield. He was wrong. It's
Hmm.
anti-vaxxers. It's Hollywood. They really don't know. They're
Yeah.
just anti-medicine. And lost is the possibility to do serious research on whether vaccines in the long term have incidents that cause side effects. And it might be for some people are more prone to it than others. And
Yes.
no research money is going into that because the drug industry is not funding it. And the
Hmm.
people who want to fund it can't really get any serious medical coverage because it's viewed as though it's a little bit of quackery. And that's really a shame
Yep.
because it would be fantastic to have some serious research done on
Right.
vaccines, good, bad, sometimes how dangerous.
Yes. There's just way too many stories and cases that correlate. And I know correlation isn't causation. I know everyone throws that out there. But good God, you would have to be living under a rock to not think before you vaccinate your baby these days because of all the stories and all of the experiences that we're hearing, and the fact that some women are just disregarded in their account of what's happened to their child is quite frankly disgusting.
No, it's remarkable to me. I mean, people literally will say, well, it can't be from the vaccine because vaccines don't cause that. So it has to be something else. And
Yeah,
you know what? That and anecdotal evidence isn't final proof evidence until it is,
that's
meaning that
right.
there are finally enough cases reported that then somebody starts to do real sampling study and random study and confirms that all those anecdotal cases are right. The same thing happened. You think of this, go back to birth control. The original incidents, and I talk about this, the FDA is getting incidents of increased, blood clots and endometrial cancer among birth control users, and they're saying, is this from the pill? Or is it just happen to be the coincidence that we
Hmm.
see a little bit of a spike among women who are doing it? Okay. They aren't sure. That sits there for years. So even when you're getting the stats, they're
Right.
reluctant to accept them and ascribe it to the drug.
Right, right. And see, the public needs to apply pressure in this area to get to the truth, because we've had this debate about whether vaccines cause autism for years now. There's still kids being affected by autism. Why aren't we studying this at the most microscopic level?
But oh, Tammy, so let's say, for instance, you want to, go ahead and lobby public officials to look into and approve some money at the NIH or that into whether there's a link between vaccines and childhood illnesses. Now, all of a sudden, it's interesting because what do governments do all around the country? Local governments require vaccines before you can get to school.
Yeah.
They want to make sure. We saw it recently in New York with the measles outbreak in upstate New York, and they closed the system down because they didn't want children going to school who weren't vaccinated. So that is also covering your own behind. It's covering the liability. They don't want to have a
Mm,
situation in which somebody goes who's not vaccinated, and then there's an outbreak of measles or something like that, and parents who otherwise were vaccinating their children now want to sue the school district because they say
right.
you allowed non-vaccinated children in. So government officials are some of the least likely to want to give money to study whether vaccines might not be good because the system has been built now on the idea that vaccines are good and they provide you, government officials at school level, some protection against litigation for otherwise communicable diseases. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. This overlap of government and our health um, has become scary to me.
Yeah,
It
well,
is downright scary because when you look at the money, I mean, I think in the past, and you know this because of your work with on 9/11 and oil and all of that, we always thought, well, oil and gas rules the world, like big oil money, big people. Oil is dwarfed by pharma,
the
absolutely dwarfed. Their lobby dollars are twice the amount of oil.
Yeah, no, it's remarkable, and you know what you said a moment ago. It's a public-private partnership. We hear that word tossed around, but it really is on this because pharma can't do it without the government being there in their corner. And what I
Hmm.
mean by that, and you know, as we sort of, if you said to me, how do you summarize this situation of where we are today? It is that before we talked about the fact only US and New Zealand allow direct to consumer ads. Well, guess what? The US is on its own in allowing drug companies unfettered power to set their own pricing. So no other country on the
Right.
planet does it. Everybody else has some form of negotiation, either with medical commissions, government negotiators. In England, you go forward and you have a new drug to treat a rare disease, and you say I'm pricing it at $1 million a year. The British government makes you show that million, they'll approve it if the $1 million a year that somebody has to take for 4 or 5 years is less than the cost of the healthcare system dealing with that disease in terms of putting people in the hospital. Occasionally they go into the ER, they have other medications they need, they have disabilities. What's the cost benefit? Here we don't do that. And that's not surprising that as a result, medications, the very same brand, marketed under a different name often, are
Hmm.
anywhere from 3 to 6 times more expensive in the US. Even on COVID, when
Hmm.
Gilead came out with remdesivir, which is now priced, it priced it at $3,200 in the US for a treatment
Yes.
and 2,400 abroad. Because why? Not because Americans have more money than their British, French, or German compatriots
Right.
or colleagues, but because they can do it.
That's
There's
right.
nobody, and as a result, the biggest effort that drug companies make is to make sure that politicians don't restrict that right,
That's
and
right.
that means they have to give money and lobbying to both sides. Democratic and Republican Party are both beholden to them, and as
Yep.
long as that's the case, we won't get real reform here on that.
Yeah. Well, we've seen that just a couple of years back too with EpiPens,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But think about this, and this thought has crossed my mind more than once. Think about these childhood vaccination injuries that we're seeing with allergies and other things, and then think about the same company selling you a $1,500 EpiPen.
Yeah, you know, it's really
You
remarkable.
really
Yeah, because I just talk about it, you know, and there's a moment in the hearings on EpiPens in which I have a chapter about pharmacy benefit managers, and anyone who's listening may say, "What is that?" And it turns
Yep.
out to be a middle person role formed by these multi-billion-dollar corporations and sort of get secret rebates on drugs and make them more expensive
Mhm.
for you. And there's a moment at the hearings in which the president of the company at that point had $600 for the EpiPen that was selling for $100 abroad, and she was asked, you know, how much does a pharmacy benefit manager get in this? And she said, I don't know. And one of the senators, you know, who was asking her question said, I'm a pharmacist and I don't know the answer to that as well. And that's part of the problem. The system's not transparent. We
Transparent,
build in
yeah.
these high prices. And she happened to be the daughter of Joe Manchin, by the way, who was a senator from West Virginia. So you talk about the marriage between politics. The
Yeah.
president of the company that had raised EpiPens at that time to a record was also the daughter of a senator. I'm not saying the senator was involved in that, but
That is
that
too
marriage.
often a coincidence. We just had a school district that was exposed to be giving over $40,000 to a lobby company, to a lobbyist company, $40,000 to pass a bill here in Colorado that actually limits our rights to opt out of vaccines. Come to find out that her son is involved in the company that is pushing that
Yeah,
that
I'm
would
not
benefit
surprised.
from that. It's
Yeah,
it's just everywhere,
yeah,
everywhere.
and so I think that at times we're sort of overloaded with information, and
Yeah.
we there's too much. That overload of information works to the benefit of companies that hope you don't see all the connections, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Pharma benefits by the fact that there isn't a simple fix to the issue of high
Yeah.
price.
Yeah.
They benefit by the fact that there are pharmacy benefit managers, and that there are orphan drugs, these so-called special drugs for small genetic diseases that affect small populations.
Mhm.
And that is all so complicated. A lot of people look at it and throw up their hands and say, I don't know
It's
what the
too
answer
much.
is.
Yeah.
It's not just one simple solution. So, and they have their lobbyists and they have their advertising people, and as a result, I think that they've used that level of confusion to a fair effect to keep the system the same because it works for them very well.
Mhm. I think 2 things, that if I had any say in being able to change what's going on, maybe 3 things. Um, the 1984 Act of no liability needs to be repealed. We
Right.
have to have liability. If there is no other company on the planet that's not liable for the product or service that they're providing, why are they
The
not?
and especially when it happens to deal not only with health but children's health in particular. The
Yeah.
And that's because they were able to convince governments that, by the way, this is a basic human health need that you must do, and the only way we can deliver it is if you free us of liability. So, you asked before why the governments aren't funding more studies into finding out if vaccines have all types of side effects that may not be so good. It's because
Mhm.
they've drank the Kool-Aid. Essentially, they bought into the argument that they're essential, and therefore, in order to give them out, pharmacy companies are only going to make them if they don't have liability. So we'll give them that, and that's a real problem.
Mhm. The second thing would be lobbying. We need to these lobbyists, it's a revolving door. They're running these companies and then they're going into government. They're getting voted out of government, they're going back to the companies. This
Yeah,
this is a revolving door of and it's so unethical.
yeah, no, it's terrible, and I know that when Trump ran for president, he said he was going to have a 5-year ban. You couldn't go in for 5
Yeah,
years, and that's not great. And then sort of the lobbyists cut that up, and the next thing you know, it wasn't really as strict. And no
mhm,
president's ever been able to really enforce it. We've
right,
had it talked about. The person who approved OxyContin, the narcotic opioid, in 1996. Dr. Wright ends up leaving the FDA and going to work for Purdue. And they're just story after story. You'll see it is they leave the government to go to work for a pharma company that's paying real money, or they set up a consulting operation to
right.
help pharma companies get through the process. They do that on orphan drugs. And that type of revolving door is one of the biggest problems we face. It could be stopped fairly easily if you had somebody in Washington who said no more, but
Mhm.
that's tough to say since Washington seems to thrive on that.
Right. Right, but that's as the public what we should be looking for when you're electing local governments and your local government matters. Do we not know that now
Yeah,
more than
absolutely.
ever?
We know that
And
on COVID,
yes.
yeah, without a doubt. I mean, we get county rules here in Miami-Dade for mask or closings or whatever else, but your local government for your city here in Miami Beach can be stricter if they want to than what the county has done. So you're
Yep.
right. It very much affects your life. And if anybody has seen the play out of COVID in terms of, small business owners or restaurant owners or people who are in the industry or travel or whatever and have been affected by it, realize the extent to which when it comes to the intersection of health and government, your livelihood can be on the line.
Absolutely. The third thing I think I would change would be or looking at the way we handle our insurance. And we didn't really talk a whole lot about that in terms of pharma, but insurance is a big player here too, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I talk about how the insurance comes out sort of in the 80s, managed care, and that, and it is together. Insurance companies, together with pharmaceutical companies, have figured out a way to make sure that the drugs that they want are on the
Mhm.
list and covered. You have drug insurance. You have to find out sometimes if it's an expensive drug, it's on a formulary. Is it a covered drug, or is it something that's not covered at all? And that's not just on a list because it's the best drug available for your condition. It's on there because of some rebate a company's got or some lobbying that takes place. And all the politics behind that makes you really scratch your head.
Yeah. And as the consumer, here we are feeling a little bit helpless. It's so frustrating because, our family pays over $1,200 a month for health insurance, but we don't subscribe to the allopathic model hardly
Right.
at all. Emergency medicine, of course, I think we're wonderful at emergency medicine here in this country. But as far as chronic disease and actual healing, I think we've got a ways to go. And it's unfortunate that because of the history of how pharmaceuticals got started, it was very opportunistic the way Rockefeller came in with the Flexner report and just basically chopping down homeopathy in the name of safety, which is very familiar again today, right? In
Yeah,
the
no,
name of safety, we've lost ancient practices that are 5,000 years old that could be way further ahead in the game of helping us.
yeah, I mean, and with this note, you're absolutely right. There was a choice at beginning around 1900 between allopathic and homeopathic.
Mm.
There was a real choice between two different types of delivering medicine, and allopathic not only prevailed through the American Medical Association and doctors and the growth of pharmaceutical companies, but it prevailed to the point of almost obliterating any alternative. That's
And that
why.
feels nefarious in the way that they did it because
Yeah,
they really went after discrediting it with terms like quackery and
yeah.
and and, and just very, opportunistic.
And very interesting when you think that many of the modern pharmaceutical companies were born out of a period with nostrums that were real quackery, but
Yeah.
they hid that part of the history.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Gerald, so much for joining me today. Before I let you go, I want you to share with everyone where they could connect with you because I can't wait to read the rest of your books, quite honestly. I'm really interested in the Mengele story and everything that has to offer. My husband's already reading it. He keeps throwing me these tidbits. I go, no, 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 don't tell me, don't tell me.
Fabulous. Well, anybody can go to my website. It's my last name, Posner, POSNER.com. There's a contact page on there. If you send me an email, I may be slow at times if I'm on deadline, but I do get back to everybody. Just be patient. On Twitter, I'm just at Gerald Posner, my full name with no break. And I'm on Facebook as Gerald Posner. And Instagram, which I don't use as much, but I'm on Instagram as well, all as Gerald Posner.
Okay. And you have 13 books total?
13 books total. And Tricia has, I call it 2.5. This is not your mother's menopause, but it was reissued as No Hormones, No Fear
Yeah.
a couple of years later. And then her last book was a study of the pharmacist who became the chief pharmacist at the largest Nazi concentration camp and got away with it after the war and went and opened up a pharmacy in Germany and then finally was arrested 20 years later. So she had a different view of the pharmaceutical industry recently.
I guess. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
No, I just think that what you're doing is fantastic because you have a podcast in which you're providing information about wellness and natural choices. And sometimes, while what we were talking about here was the drug industry, you need to understand how the drug industry started, where it made its money, how it uses promotion, how it sells products, and how it's really abandoned the field of antibiotics, let's say, to treat chronic illnesses because they're so much more profitable. So profits run. It's often profits in front of patients. And when that happens, we, the patients, suffer. So thank you for the opportunity and continue the great work.
Thank you, Gerald. Before we go, what's the next project? I'm curious.
I don't know yet.
You don't know yet?
It takes a while to figure that out. So we're still buried in pharma. I have to get my head out of medicine for a while, and I haven't been able to do that. So I'm not sure yet.
Okay, well, I'll be looking for it for sure. And thank you again for being a guest on the Naturally Inspired podcast today.
Thanks, Tammy, so much. It was really great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If the Naturally Inspired movement makes sense to you, let's do this together and transform the medical model and help people take charge of their health. Learn more about how you can join the Naturally Inspired movement by going to naturallyinspiredadvocate.com or call me at 970-475-4862.